The warm summer sun hung lazily in the clear blue sky as John sat on his porch surveying his meticulously tended flower beds. He took pride in his garden, a kaleidoscope of colours and fragrances that had become the talk of the neighbourhood. But amidst the vibrant blooms, a persistent problem marred his tranquil oasis, his neighbour's cat. The neighbour, Mr. Thompson, had a reputation for his love of gardening, and his lush, meticulously manicured flower beds were a testament to his dedication. However, his green thumb enthusiasm was countered by his frustration over an unwelcome visitor, a mischievous feline that had become the bane of his existence. For weeks, John had been plagued by the cat's nefarious deeds. It would saunter into his yard, defile his flower beds with its foul deposits, and to add insult to injury, it made a habit of marking its territory by spraying John's patio doors. The stench was unbearable, and scrubbing glass doors clean had become a regular, tedious chore. One sunny afternoon, as John was on his hands and knees, painstakingly removing cat droppings from his prized roses, Mr. Thompson wandered over. His eyes bore the weariness of a man who had shared John's frustrations. "John, I don't know what to do about that darn cat of mine," Mr. Thompson lamented, eyeing the flower beds with a mixture of annoyance and helplessness. John rose to his feet, wiping sweat from his brow. "You and me both, Mr. Thompson. I've tried everything to keep it out of my yard, but it just keeps coming back. I've even spoken to you about it before." Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression apologetic. "I know, John, and I've tried to keep him indoors, but he's a stubborn one. He always finds his way out." John sighed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "Well, something needs to be done, or I'm going to lose my mind. I've spent hours cleaning up after that cat, and it's ruining my flowers." Mr. Thompson sighed in agreement, his eyes locking onto the patio doors marred by the cat's territorial markings. "I'll talk to my wife again, John. Maybe we can come up with a solution." But despite Mr. Thompson's well-intentioned promises, the cat continued its reign of terror in John's garden. Days turned into weeks, and the situation showed no signs of improving. John's frustration deepened, and simmering resentment began to take hold. One night, after yet another exasperating encounter with the cat, John's frustration reached its breaking point. He was tired of cleaning up after an animal that seemed immune to reason. As he lay in bed, his mind raced, searching for a solution that would finally teach his neighbours a lesson. Inspiration struck like a lightning bolt. John knew he couldn't harm the cat, but he could make sure its misdeeds came back to haunt Mr. Thompson and his family in a way they'd never forget. The next day, John set his plan into motion. He gathered a 2-foot length of 6-inch diameter pipe and a cardboard box measuring 2 feet square. With precision, he cut a hole in the side of the box and slid the pipe through it, sealing them together with layers of duct tape. His face held a determined focus as he prepared to execute his scheme. John's intentions were clear. He wouldn't hurt the cat, but he'd certainly make sure it left its mark where it mattered most to his neighbours. He had heard Mr. Thompson's wife mention how much they cherished their new white living room furniture, which included a couch, a couple of chairs, and a footstool. It was their pride and joy, and John was about to turn it into their worst nightmare. Inside the box, John placed an open can of tuna, a tempting lure for the unsuspecting cat. He sealed the box shut, making sure it was secure, and then strategically placed it next to his patio doors, just inches away from where the cat often sprayed. That night, John lay in bed, his heart pounding with anticipation. He knew that the cat would eventually find its way into the box, driven by the scent of the tantalizing tuna. As he drifted off to sleep, he couldn't help but smile, imagining the chaos that would ensue once the trap was sprung. The first night after setting his trap, John lay awake, listening for any signs of commotion. But the house next door remained eerily silent. The cat had not taken the bait. As the days turned into weeks, John's frustration mounted. He couldn't understand why the cat had not fallen into his cleverly laid trap. Had he grown wary of his tactics, or had it simply moved on to terrorize another neighbor's garden? But then one morning John noticed something unusual. on his sidewalk, a series of fresh cat paw prints covered in grease. He couldn't help but chuckle. It appeared that his plan had worked after all. The cat had finally taken the bait. From this point on, John's story became a mix of facts and speculation. He could only imagine what had transpired at his neighbour's house after the cat had returned home, its paws and fur smeared with axle grease. His vivid imagination painted a picture of chaos and panic. In his mind's eye, he saw the cat bounding through the Thompsons' front door, oblivious to the black smears it left in its wake. The once white living-room furniture had become a canvas for dark streaks, and the cat's frantic attempts to clean itself only added to the mess. John couldn't help but smile at the thought of Mr. Thompson and his family, desperately trying to salvage their beloved furniture. The black grease resisted their frantic efforts, mocking their futile attempts to restore it to its former glory. Soon, John's neighbourhood buzzed with rumours about the Thompsons' unfortunate misfortune. He heard whispers of furniture cleaners, carpet cleaners, and exasperated family members who had unwittingly become victims of their own cat's mischief. As John watched from the shadows, he realized that his plan had unleashed a series of unintended consequences. Revenge had been sweet, but it had also left a bitter taste in his mouth. In the end, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for what he had set in motion. And so, as he continued to tend to his flower beds, he made a silent vow to put an end to the cycle of frustration and retaliation. Days turned into weeks, and the initial satisfaction of his revenge began to fade for John. He found himself pondering the consequences of his actions more deeply, the guilt gnawing at his conscience. As he looked across the fence at the Thompsons' house, he couldn't help but feel a sense of remorse for what he had put them through. One evening, as the sun set over the neighbourhood, John decided it was time to make amends. He walked over to the Thompsons' front door, armed with a heartfelt apology and a freshly baked apple pie. He rang the doorbell and waited, anxiety knotting in his stomach. "Mr. Thompson," answered the door, his expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. "John, what brings you here?" John cleared his throat, his voice earnest. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened with the cat and the furniture. I feel responsible for the mess, and I'm truly sorry for any inconvenience it caused." Mr. Thompson studied John for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty, John. It was quite a mess, but let's not dwell on it. We've had our fair share of challenges with that cat." John extended the apple pie, a peace offering of sorts. "I thought maybe we could put all of this behind us and move forward as neighbours." A hint of a smile crossed Mr. Thompson's face as he accepted the pie. "That sounds like a good idea, John. No hard feelings." Over time, the tension between the two neighbours began to ease. They shared a few laughs over coffee, talked about their shared frustrations with gardening, and even swapped stories about their respective childhood pets. The cat, once the source of animosity, became a topic of mutual sympathy. As for the cat itself, it seemed to sense the shift in the air. It visited John's yard less frequently, and when it did, it kept its distance. The Thompsons made a concerted effort to keep their pet indoors, ensuring it no longer roamed freely in John's garden. One sunny afternoon, as John tended to his flower beds, Mr. Thompson walked over with a small potted plant in hand. "I thought this might brighten up your garden," he said with a smile. John accepted the plant graciously, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I appreciate it." From that day forward, the two neighbours shared a newfound camaraderie. They no longer saw each other as adversaries, but as friends who had weathered a storm together. The cat, once a source of conflict, became a symbol of their shared history and the lessons they had learned along the way. As the years passed, John's garden flourished, and the Thompsons' living-room furniture remained spotless. The cat, now older and wiser, continued to visit both houses, but its presence no longer carried the same weight of frustration and resentment. In the end, John realized that sometimes it took a bit of mischief, a dash of remorse, and a lot of forgiveness to build bridges between neighbours. And as he watched the sun set over their peaceful neighbourhood, he couldn't help but smile, knowing that he had taught not only his neighbours but also himself a valuable lesson in compassion and reconciliation. As the years went by, John's efforts to make amends with his neighbours continued. He and Mr. Thompson shared conversations over the fence, exchanged gardening tips, and even helped each other with occasional yard work. It seemed that their feud with the cat had indeed faded into the past, replaced by a sense of neighbourly goodwill. However, the peace they had achieved would soon be shattered by an unexpected turn of events. One fateful evening, as John was enjoying a quiet dinner with his family, the peace was shattered by a blood-curdling scream from the Thompsons' house. Alarmed and fearing the worst, John rushed outside and over to his neighbour's yard, where he found Mr. Thompson in a state of shock, his face ashen. "Mr. Thompson, what happened?" John asked, panic rising within him. Mr. Thompson pointed trembling fingers towards the driveway, where the lifeless body of their beloved cat lay motionless. It's my fault," Mr. Thompson stammered. "I didn't see him as I was pulling into the driveway. It happened so fast." John's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. The cat, the very source of their previous animosity and reconciliation, now lay dead at their feet. It was a tragic accident, but the weight of guilt and sorrow was unbearable. Mrs. Thompson rushed out of the house, her eyes filled with tears as she saw her lifeless pet. She cradled the cat in her arms, whispering apologies and farewells through her sobs. "I'm so sorry," John said, his voice choked with emotion. The Thompsons' grief was palpable, and John couldn't help but share in their sorrow. The cat had been a part of their family for years, and its untimely demise was a painful blow to all. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere between John and the Thompsons grew heavy with grief and guilt. The once friendly exchanges over the fence ceased, replaced by awkward silence and a sense of sadness that seemed impossible to overcome. The accident had cast a dark shadow over their relationship, a constant reminder of the consequences of their past grievances. The once peaceful neighbourhood was now marred by an air of melancholy, and it seemed that there was no way to repair the damage that had been done. As time passed, the Thompsons decided to move away from the house they had called home for so many years. The memories of their beloved cat were too painful to bear in a place filled with reminders of their loss. John watched as the moving trucks pulled away, carrying the Thompsons and their grief to a new beginning. The house next door remained empty for months, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had torn their neighbourhood apart. John couldn't help but blame himself for what had transpired, knowing that his actions had played a part in the heartbreaking turn of events. In the end, the lesson John had learned was a painful one. Sometimes even the best of intentions can lead to unintended consequences. The feud with the cat had ended in tragedy, and the price of their past grievances had been immeasurable. As John gazed at the empty house next door, he couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to make amends for the pain he had unwittingly caused. It was a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his days, a reminder that forgiveness and reconciliation were often the only paths to true peace and healing.